Pirate First's pipe dream, the Cenote Chronicles, begins.
Part 0. Entering the Formation. MXDM, aka Pirate 1 or VJ, CinemaX. July 28, 2026. Chapter 1. Publisher's Note. There are books that describe a technology. There are books that advocate a political philosophy. There are books that speculate about the future. This volume belongs comfortably to none of these categories. Pipe Dream is presented as a work of speculative civilization design, an attempt to follow a single proposition to its logical conclusion with as much technical discipline, institutional rigor, and philosophical consistency as possible. Its central question is deceptively simple. What kind of civilization becomes possible when biological healthspan, rather than economic extraction, is treated as society's primary resource? Everything that follows emerges from that question. The engineering described in these pages is not offered as established scientific fact, nor as medical guidance, nor as an architectural blueprint awaiting immediate construction. Where the work discusses pressure physiology, longevity, ecological management, governance systems, constitutional design, energy production, or economic organization, it does so within the framework of speculative inquiry. Readers should distinguish between documented science, emerging research, established engineering practice, informed extrapolation, and deliberate fiction. Throughout this work, those categories are intentionally placed in conversation with one another, but they are not interchangeable. The world presented here is neither utopian nor dystopian. It is procedural. Its institutions arise from constraints rather than wishes. Its architecture follows geology. Its governance follows ecology. Its economics follow biology. Its culture follows the daily experience of inhabiting an environment unlike any civilization has previously chosen to call home. Nothing is introduced merely because it appears futuristic. Every proposal is expected to justify its existence. Every institution must solve a problem. Every technology must produce consequences beyond its immediate function. Every constitutional provision must anticipate the generations that will inherit it. Readers expecting a conventional work of science fiction may find an unusual abundance of engineering. Readers expecting an engineering proposal may find an unusual abundance of political philosophy. Readers expecting a political treatise may discover an unexpectedly persistent interest in biology, culture, architecture, and the accumulation of knowledge across generations. This is intentional. Civilizations are not assembled in disciplinary compartments. No society has ever been built from engineering alone. No enduring political order has ever rested solely upon law. No economy exists independently of the biological beings whose lives it ultimately serves. The purpose of this work is therefore not to predict the future. It is to investigate the consequences of adopting a different first principle. Human history has repeatedly organized itself around the management of scarcity. River valleys, mineral deposits, trade routes,
coal, oil,
electricity, computation. Each resource reshaped institutions in its own image. This work asks what follows if civilization instead organizes itself around the production, preservation, and multiplication of healthy human years. That proposition is explored patiently, not through proclamation, but through accumulation. A geological formation becomes a habitat. A habitat becomes a municipality. A municipality becomes a constitutional order. A constitutional order becomes a research commons. A research commons becomes a longevity civilization. And a longevity civilization begins producing consequences that its founders themselves could not have anticipated. The reader is invited to follow this progression without assuming where it leads. Many of the most significant developments described in these pages do not emerge because someone planned them from the beginning. They emerge because solving one problem makes previously impossible questions worth asking. The first generation descends beneath the Yucatan to build a place in which they might live longer, healthier, and more meaningful lives. They discover, instead, that they have begun building an entirely different kind of civilization. Whether such a civilization should exist is a question for the reader. Whether it could exist is the question this book attempts to explore. The descent begins here. Welcome to the formation. Chapter 2. Preface. Why this book exists. There are books that explain an invention. There are books that propose a policy. There are books that imagine a future. This book attempts something different. It describes the institutional architecture of a civilization that does not yet exist but that could, in principle, be built. Not through miracles, not through technological wish fulfillment, and not through the suspension of scientific reasoning, but through the gradual accumulation of engineering, governance, medicine, ecology, economics, architecture, and culture around a single organizing insight. That insight is deceptively simple. Civilizations have always organized themselves around the resource they considered most valuable. River civilizations organized themselves around fresh water. Maritime civilizations organized themselves around trade. Industrial civilizations organized themselves around energy. Financial civilizations organized themselves around capital. Information civilizations organized themselves around data. Pipe Dream asks a different question. What if a civilization organized itself around health? Not healthcare. Not hospitals. Not insurance. Health itself. Not the treatment of illness after it appears, but the deliberate cultivation of the environmental conditions under which human biology performs at its fullest potential across an entire lifetime. That distinction changes everything. It changes economics because longevity becomes productive infrastructure rather than medical expenditure. It changes politics because governance is judged by the biological conditions it preserves rather than by the wealth it redistributes. It changes architecture because buildings become therapeutic instruments rather than merely shelters. It changes environmental policy because ecological integrity becomes public health infrastructure. It changes education because a population expecting a century or more of vigorous intellectual life learns differently than one expecting decline. It changes scientific research because longitudinal observation becomes civilization's greatest strategic asset. Most books begin with a technology and ask what society would do with it. Pipe Dream begins with a society and asks what technologies it would inevitably create. That inversion is deliberate. This is not a manifesto for a single invention. It is an attempt to describe the recursive consequences that emerge when one successful innovation begins reshaping every institution around it. The crystal tube, the nitrox galleries, the pressure physiology, the research commons, redeemer governance, the commons ownership principle, the longevity economy, the terraform operator, the biological commonwealth. None of these are presented as isolated ideas. Each exists because another idea made it necessary. Each creates pressures that require another institutional response. Each solution produces another question. By the end of the work, what began as an engineering proposal has become an entirely different model of civilization. That is the structure of this book. Readers looking for a single invention may occasionally wonder why the discussion wanders into constitutional law, insurance actuarial science, municipal governance, architecture, marine biology, cultural production, educational systems, or intergenerational stewardship. It has not wandered. It has followed the consequences. Real civilizations are never built from isolated technologies. They emerge from networks of interacting institutions whose logic becomes visible only when considered together. Pipe Dream therefore asks the reader for an unusual kind of patience. Many chapters will appear to solve one problem. Only later will it become apparent that they were quietly laying the foundations for another. A pressure management protocol becomes a medical doctrine. A medical doctrine becomes an economic model. An economic model becomes a constitutional principle. A constitutional principle becomes a cultural identity. A cultural identity becomes the defining characteristic of a civilization. This recursive architecture explains why the book grows steadily broader as it progresses. The subject is not expanding. Its consequences are. Readers familiar with traditional science fiction may notice another difference. Pipe Dream is not primarily interested in predicting gadgets. It is interested in predicting institutions. Machines change quickly. Civilizations change slowly. History remembers institutions. The aquifers beneath the Yucatan Peninsula are therefore not presented merely as geological formations. They are treated as environments capable of generating entirely new political philosophies, medical practices, economic arrangements, architectural traditions, artistic movements, and scientific disciplines. The geology is not scenery. It is the first constitutional document. The formation writes the civilization before the civilization writes itself. Some readers will agree with these arguments. Others will reject them entirely. Both responses are welcome. The purpose of this work is not to recruit believers. It is to present a coherent civilizational hypothesis clearly enough that it can be examined, criticized, improved, or disproved. Speculation without internal discipline quickly becomes fantasy. Speculation constrained by engineering, biology, economics, and institutional logic becomes something more useful. Throughout these pages, every proposal attempts to answer the same question. If this were true, what else would necessarily become true? That question is the engine of the entire project. It is also the reason this book exists. Pipe Dream is not the end of that inquiry. It is the beginning. The civilization described here eventually reaches beyond the Earth. Not because space exploration is its objective, but because a civilization that successfully reorganizes itself around health, longevity, stewardship, and scientific continuity eventually acquires capabilities that earlier civilizations could scarcely imagine. Those future consequences belong to later works. They are not this book. This volume remains grounded. Its concern is the formation itself, the aquifer, the settlement, the institutions, the people, the medical protocols, the governance, the economics, the culture. The first civilization in history that deliberately chose to organize itself around the biological life well lived. Everything that follows grows from there. Welcome to the formation. The descent begins now. Part 0. Entering the Formation. Chapter 3. How to read this book. Most books begin with a story. This one begins with a civilization. That distinction matters. A conventional narrative asks you to follow characters through events. The people move, the world reacts, and meaning emerges from plot. The pipe dream works in the opposite direction. Here, the world comes first. The institutions come first. The physics comes first. The incentives come first. Only then do the people arrive. This is intentional. The purpose of this work is not merely to entertain, but to demonstrate that civilizations are themselves technologies, systems that can be designed, tested, criticized, improved, and eventually replaced when superior designs become possible. For that reason, this book rarely asks whether something is desirable before asking whether it is internally coherent. Can it function? Can it sustain itself? Can it improve itself without destroying the conditions that allowed it to emerge? Only after those questions have been answered do questions of politics, culture, aesthetics, and ethics become meaningful. Readers expecting a traditional narrative may initially find this disorienting. Entire chapters discuss governance before there are citizens, economics before there are markets, medicine before there are patients, architecture before there are buildings. The order is deliberate. A civilization is not assembled from its visible parts. It is assembled from the invisible relationships that determine how those visible parts will eventually behave. Throughout these pages, you will encounter proposals that range from immediately practical to unapologetically speculative. Some chapters describe engineering that could begin tomorrow. Others describe institutions that would require decades of experimentation. Still others examine possibilities whose realization may belong to future generations entirely. These distinctions are not flaws. They are the natural consequence of writing about civilization as an evolving system rather than a finished object. No reader is expected to agree with every proposal. Agreement is not the objective. Understanding is. Whenever an unfamiliar concept appears, resist the temptation to ask immediately whether it is realistic. Instead, ask a different question. If this were possible, what else would become possible? That question is the engine of this book. Every proposal should be evaluated not only on its own merits, but also on the chain of consequences that follows from it. Throughout the pipe dream, engineering is rarely presented as an end in itself. Engineering changes economics. Economics changes governance. Governance changes culture. Culture changes civilization. The technical innovation is often the smallest part of the story. Its consequences are the real subject. Readers may therefore notice that chapters often spend relatively little time describing a technology itself and far more time exploring what that technology would make inevitable. This is not accidental. History rarely remembers the invention. History remembers what the invention made possible. The steam engine mattered because it reorganized civilization. The printing press mattered because it reorganized knowledge. The internet mattered because it reorganized communication. Likewise, the cenote infrastructure described throughout this work matters less as engineering than as the foundation upon which an entirely different civilization becomes possible. Some readers will approach this work as engineers, others as physicians, others as economists, architects, political theorists, marine biologists, urban planners, artists, investors, philosophers, or simply curious citizens. Each will encounter different books hidden inside the same pages. That, too, is intentional. Civilizations cannot be understood through a single discipline. Reality itself refuses to respect academic departments. The most important ideas are usually born precisely where those departments overlap. For that reason, this book invites the reader to move continuously between scales. One paragraph may discuss oxygen diffusion through biological tissue. The next may discuss constitutional governance. The next may examine insurance markets. The next may ask how communities create meaning through music, ritual, or shared experience. All belong to the same conversation. Because civilization is not a collection of isolated systems. It is one system observed from different distances. Finally, a word about certainty. Nothing in these pages should be mistaken for prophecy. This book does not claim to predict the future. It proposes trajectories. Some will prove mistaken. Some will prove incomplete. Some may prove unexpectedly conservative. Others may become obsolete before this volume reaches its final readers. That is the fate of every serious attempt to think ahead. The objective is not to be infallible. The objective is to widen the range of futures that civilization is capable of imagining before circumstance forces it to choose among them. If, by the final page, the reader finds themselves looking at governments, medicine, infrastructure, economics, education, culture, and even evolution itself through a different lens than the one with which they began, then this book will have achieved its purpose. Do not read these pages as a blueprint. Read them as an expedition. The formation has been waiting for 66 million years. We have only just begun to descend. Part 0. Entering the Formation. Chapter 4. The civilization organized around health. Every civilization has a center of gravity. Not a geographical center. A philosophical one. A civilization is ultimately organized around whatever resource it considers indispensable to its own continuity. Everything else, its institutions, laws, economy, architecture, education, culture, and politics gradually reorganizes itself around protecting, producing, and distributing that resource. The river civilizations organize themselves around fertile floodplains. Maritime empires organize themselves around ports and sea lanes. Industrial societies organize themselves around energy. Financial societies organize themselves around capital. Information societies increasingly organize themselves around data. Each of these organizing principles produced not only wealth, but an entire way of understanding the world. The resource determined what became valuable. Value determined institutions. Institutions determined culture. Culture determined civilization. The pipe dream begins by asking a question that history has rarely asked. What if the primary resource were neither land, nor energy, nor information? What if the primary resource were the biological quality of human life itself? Not healthcare. Not medicine. Not hospitals. Health. There is an important difference. Healthcare is primarily concerned with repairing damage after it occurs. A civilization organized around health is primarily concerned with designing conditions in which damage becomes progressively less common. The distinction is subtle, but it changes everything. When health becomes civilization's primary resource, the incentives begin to reverse themselves. Instead of asking how efficiently disease can be treated, society asks how intelligently wellness can be maintained. Instead of measuring success by economic output alone, it begins measuring whether its citizens remain biologically capable of enjoying the lives that prosperity makes possible. Infrastructure is evaluated not only by what it builds, but by what it prevents. Architecture becomes preventative medicine. Urban planning becomes cognitive science. Environmental stewardship becomes public health. Education becomes neurological development. Economic policy becomes longevity policy. Politics becomes the management of biological conditions rather than merely the management of competing interests. This is not a rejection of economics. It is a redefinition of wealth. The greatest wealth any civilization possesses is not stored in vaults, databases, or stock exchanges. It exists inside the bodies and minds of the people who inhabit it. A civilization that quietly shortens healthy lives while increasing financial output is consuming its own capital without recognizing the loss. A civilization that extends healthy lives while preserving ecological integrity is generating a form of wealth that compounds across generations. That observation forms the philosophical foundation of this book. The cenote formations beneath the Yucatan are not presented merely as unusual geological features. Within these pages, they become something much larger. They become natural infrastructure. For 66 million years, the formation has quietly maintained conditions unlike those found on the surface: stable temperatures, immense freshwater reserves, distinctive pressure environments, exceptional ecological continuity, and biological systems shaped by extraordinary geological history. The formation was never designed for humanity. Yet humanity may eventually learn to organize itself around the opportunities the formation quietly offers. That possibility gives birth to the civilization described throughout this work. The longevity principality. It is not simply a city beneath the earth, nor is it merely a medical community. It is an experiment in civilizational priorities. Its institutions exist for a different purpose than those of conventional states. Its economy values different outputs. Its governance protects different commons. Its architecture solves different problems. Its scientific institutions pursue different questions. Its culture emerges from different daily experiences. Everything changes because the organizing principle has changed. This transformation is best understood not as a technological revolution, but as a civilizational inversion. For thousands of years, humanity altered environments in order to increase production. The longevity principality alters production in order to preserve environments. Economic growth remains important. Innovation remains essential. Scientific discovery accelerates rather than slows. Yet all of them become subordinate to a more fundamental objective: maintaining the conditions under which human biological potential can continue unfolding across generations. Readers should resist the temptation to see this merely as a proposal for an unusual municipality. Municipalities administer places. Civilizations organize values. The distinction is immense. The cenote city is only the first visible expression of an entirely different philosophy of civilization. Redeemer emerges because governance must evolve to manage biological commons. The research commons emerges because knowledge itself becomes public infrastructure. The longevity economy emerges because prevention proves more valuable than intervention. The cultural commons emerges because communities require shared meaning as much as shared resources. Even engineering changes. Technology is no longer judged primarily by its sophistication. It is judged by whether it preserves, strengthens, or expands the biological conditions upon which civilization ultimately depends. This shift explains why so many pages in this book appear to discuss subjects far removed from medicine. Hydrogen systems. geodesic architecture, pressure physiology, commons governance, insurance economics, atmospheric management, acoustic ecology, education.
Law. Culture.
Each appears separate. They are not. They are all expressions of the same organizing principle: health. Not health as an industry, health as civilization. Once this idea is accepted, the remainder of the book becomes easier to navigate. The engineering is no longer just engineering. The economics is no longer just economics. The governance is no longer simply governance. Every chapter is another answer to the same question. If the biological life, well-lived, becomes civilization's primary resource, what follows? The remainder of the pipe dream is an exploration of that question. Its answers extend from individual physiology to constitutional law, from atmospheric chemistry to cultural identity, from municipal governance to interstellar civilization. Long before humanity builds cities beneath alien oceans, before engineered companions cross the stars, before the apex negotiate with humanity, before the continuants inherit a civilization measured in millennia rather than generations, one quieter revolution must occur. Civilization must remember what it is for. Not perpetual consumption. Not perpetual growth. Not perpetual competition. The flourishing of conscious life. Everything else is infrastructure. Part 0. Entering the Formation. Chapter 5. The Reader's Compass. First dash, second dash, and third order effects. Every proposal changes more than the thing it appears to change. This observation is so simple that it is easy to overlook. History, however, is little more than the accumulated record of consequences that no one anticipated when the original decision was made. The steam engine was not merely a better pump. It reorganized labor. It reorganized transportation. It reorganized warfare. It reorganized cities. It reorganized family life. Eventually, it reorganized civilization itself. Likewise, the internet was never simply a communications network. It altered commerce. It transformed education. It redistributed political power. It changed friendship. It changed journalism. It changed loneliness. It changed memory. Very few people who helped build either technology foresaw the civilization that would emerge around it. The invention was only the beginning. The consequences were the real event. This book has been written according to that understanding. Every proposal contained within these pages should be evaluated not only by what it immediately accomplishes, but by the chain of transformations it quietly sets into motion. To help navigate those chains, this work adopts a simple framework. 3 orders of consequences. Not because reality stops there. Reality never does. But because by the third order we have usually reached the point where institutions, cultures, and civilizations begin reorganizing themselves around the original innovation. Understanding these 3 orders will make every chapter that follows considerably easier to read. First order effects. First order effects are immediate. They answer the question: what does this proposal directly accomplish? A pressure-regulated nitrox habitat increases oxygen availability. A hydrogen production system generates energy. A research commons gathers longitudinal data. A governance protocol coordinates decision-making. These are direct outcomes. They are measurable. They are generally the easiest effects to observe because they occur closest to the original intervention. Most technical literature rarely looks beyond this stage. The engineer asks whether the bridge stands. The physician asks whether the treatment works. The economist asks whether the market clears. All are important questions. None are sufficient. Second-order effects. Second-order effects ask a different question. Once the first-order effects become reliable, what begins changing because they exist? Reliable therapeutic environments reduce chronic illness. Reduced chronic illness changes healthcare expenditure. Healthcare expenditure changes insurance models. Insurance models change investment incentives. Investment incentives change urban development. Urban development changes migration. Migration changes communities. The engineering has disappeared from view. Its consequences have not. The same pattern repeats throughout this work. Pressure physiology becomes longevity. Longevity becomes actuarial confidence. Actuarial confidence becomes institutional investment. Institutional investment becomes permanent settlement. Permanent settlement becomes civilization. The technology remains present. It simply recedes into the background. Successful infrastructure eventually becomes invisible. No civilization spends its days admiring its plumbing. It simply depends upon it. Third-order effects. Third-order effects emerge only after institutions begin adapting to the second-order changes. These are the consequences that reshape civilization itself. Children born into the new conditions no longer experience them as innovations. They experience them as normal. Normal expectations create new cultures. New cultures create new institutions. New institutions create new civilizations. This is where the pipe dream spends much of its attention. A therapeutic environment becomes a longevity economy. A longevity economy requires biological governance. Biological governance creates the political philosophy of the biological commonwealth. The biological commonwealth produces different educational systems. Different educational systems produce different scientific cultures. Different scientific cultures produce different ethical questions. Eventually, humanity is no longer merely living differently. It is thinking differently. By the third order, civilization has quietly become something else. Why this matters? Many readers encountering an unfamiliar proposal instinctively ask whether it would work. That is a necessary question. It is rarely the most interesting one. A more revealing question is this: if it worked, what else would change? That question appears repeatedly throughout this book. Sometimes the answer occupies only a paragraph. Sometimes it occupies several chapters. Occasionally it occupies an entire future volume. One of the central arguments of the pipe dream is that civilization has historically underestimated second-order and third-order effects while becoming fascinated by first-order engineering. We celebrate inventions. We often fail to notice the civilizations they quietly create. An example. Consider something as seemingly modest as a residential pressure habitat. The first-order effect is straightforward. Residents spend their daily lives within a carefully maintained therapeutic environment. Health markers improve. Inflammation declines. Research data accumulates. The second-order effects begin almost immediately. Insurance companies notice. Universities establish research fellowships. Medical industries negotiate licensing agreements. Construction standards evolve. Communities form around health rather than proximity to employment. Entire economic sectors begin reorganizing around prevention rather than treatment. Then the third-order effects arrive. Children grow up assuming health maintenance is simply how civilization works. Political debates focus less on managing disease and more on preserving biological potential. The community develops its own artistic traditions inspired by the formation. Architecture begins expressing therapeutic philosophy. Education emphasizes biological stewardship. Governance gradually measures success not only through economic production but through healthy years of life created for future generations. Nothing about the pressure habitat changed. Everything built around it did. Looking further. As this book progresses, the chains become progressively longer. The engineering discussed in early chapters eventually produces consequences that reach far beyond engineering. The hydrogen systems explored here eventually become the energy doctrine of entirely new civilizations. The governance systems become constitutional traditions. The research commons become the intellectual foundation of future species. The educational institutions become cultural inheritance. The architectural decisions become philosophy made visible. Eventually, ideas first introduced as engineering become history. That is precisely how civilizations evolve. The long view. Readers may occasionally wonder why a chapter appears to spend relatively little time discussing its own subject. A chapter about hydrogen soon becomes a chapter about economics. A chapter about economics becomes one about governance. A chapter about governance becomes one about culture. A chapter about culture quietly becomes one about the future of intelligence itself. This is not a departure from the subject. It is the subject. Civilization is the accumulated interaction of consequences unfolding across time. No institution exists in isolation. No invention remains confined to its original purpose. Every successful innovation eventually escapes its inventor. The purpose of this book is not merely to describe inventions. It is to follow them until they become civilizations. That journey begins beneath the Yucatan Peninsula. It does not end there. By the time it reaches the stars, the engineering will have become tradition. The tradition will have become philosophy. And the philosophy will have become the inheritance of beings who no longer remember a world before the formation taught humanity that its greatest resource was not what it could extract from the earth, but what it could cultivate within itself. Chapter 6. Roadmap of Civilizational Consequences. Every civilization begins with a decision so ordinary that later generations forget it was ever made. A river is settled. A harbor is fortified. A crop is domesticated. A road is paved. Centuries later, people speak of empires as though they were inevitable. They were not. They were consequences. This book asks the reader to witness the beginning of another chain of consequences. Not because its conclusions are predetermined, but because every civilization is ultimately the accumulated result of countless decisions whose significance only becomes visible when viewed across generations rather than years. The pipe dream begins with a geological formation. It ends with a question. Everything between those 2 points is consequence. The first horizon. The first horizon is practical. It asks a simple question. Can a civilization organize itself around the conditions that produce health rather than merely treating disease? This question gives birth to everything immediately visible throughout these pages. Pressure physiology. The nitrox galleries. The research commons. Hydrogen infrastructure. Crystal tube mobility. Redeemer governance. Commons ownership. Ecological stewardship. Insurance economics. Educational institutions. Architectural doctrine. None of these ideas exist independently. Each exists because every other idea requires it. The civilization is not assembled piece by piece. It grows. Like coral. Like a forest. Like the formation itself. The first horizon occupies the entirety of this book. It asks whether such a civilization could exist. The second horizon. Suppose the answer is yes. Suppose generations pass. The data accumulates. The institutions stabilize. The economy matures. The culture develops. The therapeutic environment proves itself scientifically. Insurance systems adapt. Universities participate. Medical practice changes. Children grow up regarding longevity as infrastructure rather than privilege. At that point, a different question emerges. If humanity learns how to design environments that systematically improve biological potential, will those same design principles remain confined to Earth? Or will they travel? The second horizon asks whether civilization itself becomes exportable. Not merely its technology, its philosophy, its institutions, its understanding of life. The answer leads toward a work that follows this one. The longevity principality. There, the cenote civilization is no longer an experiment. It is a mature society. Its concerns are constitutional rather than speculative. Its medicine has become governance. Its research has become tradition. Its philosophy has become ordinary life. The questions become larger because the civilization itself has become real. The third horizon. Civilizations eventually encounter problems that biology alone cannot solve. Deep oceans. Extreme gravity. Persistent radiation. Interstellar distances. Planetary environments for which baseline humanity was never naturally adapted. At some point, engineering ceases to modify buildings. It begins modifying civilization itself, not through conquest, through necessity. The same engineering principles introduced in these pages, pressure, environmental adaptation, biological stewardship, systems thinking, resilience, become the foundation upon which entirely new forms of life are intentionally cultivated. Not replacements. Companions. Civilizations capable of inhabiting environments that humanity cannot yet survive without extraordinary cost. This horizon belongs to Super-Earth, Age of the Apes. Its engineering appears fantastical only because its foundations were laid much earlier. The underwater cities, the biological commons, the governance doctrine, the pressure philosophy, the research traditions, the educational systems, the engineering culture, the patient accumulation of knowledge across generations. Nothing appears suddenly. The stars are reached using ideas first tested beneath the earth. The fourth horizon. Even civilizations built for the stars eventually encounter another question. Who carries knowledge across deep time? Not merely across generations, across epochs. As biological engineering matures, as artificial intelligence evolves from tool to collaborator, as voluntary augmentation becomes commonplace, and as missions require minds capable of remaining coherent across centuries, civilization begins producing something entirely new. The continuance. Not immortal, not omniscient, not detached from humanity, but dedicated to continuity itself. Knowledge becomes their inheritance. Exploration becomes their vocation. Adaptation becomes their craft. Some remain close to their origins. Others are purpose-built for missions that ordinary biology could never survive. Some travel toward environments so extreme that even the apex would regard them as hostile. Others remain among humanity as historians, diplomats, philosophers, scientists, and custodians of civilizations measured not in decades, but in millennia. Each is another expression of the same principle first introduced beneath the Yucatan Peninsula. Life flourishes when civilization intentionally cultivates the conditions that allow it to do so. The thread that connects them all. Readers may be tempted to see these horizons as separate stories. They are not. They are different temporal scales describing the same civilizational experiment. The pipe dream asks, can civilization be organized around health? The longevity principality asks, what does such a civilization become after it matures? Super-Earth, Age of the Apes asks, what happens when that civilization reaches the stars and chooses to create biological companions rather than merely sending machines? The continuance asks, what becomes of intelligence once continuity itself becomes civilization's highest responsibility? Each work begins where the previous one quietly ends. Why begin here? Some readers may wonder why a story that eventually reaches other stars begins inside a flooded limestone formation beneath the Yucatan Peninsula. Because civilizations rarely announce themselves when they begin. The Roman Empire began as a settlement. The Industrial Revolution began with better engines. The Information Age began with improved methods of transmitting signals. The greatest transformations often appear almost insignificant while they are happening. Only later does history discover where the turning point actually occurred. Perhaps future historians, human, apex, or continuant, will one day conclude that the first step toward interstellar civilization was not taken aboard a spacecraft. It was taken when humanity finally asked a different question. Not how to conquer nature, not how to consume more, not how to grow faster, but how to organize civilization around the long flourishing of conscious life. Everything that follows is a consequence. The formation comes first. The civilization follows. The stars are simply farther downstream. Chapter 7. Threshold. Entering the formation. Every journey begins twice. The first time, it begins in the imagination. The second time, it begins with a step. Everything you have read until now belongs to the first beginning. The chapters of this opening section have not attempted to persuade you that the civilization described in these pages is inevitable. Nor have they asked you to suspend disbelief. They have asked something much simpler: to consider the possibility that civilization itself is a design problem. That possibility is the threshold. Crossing it changes how every page that follows will be read. Beyond this point, the pipe dream no longer speaks primarily about ideas. It begins describing a place. Not merely a location beneath the Yucatan Peninsula. A way of inhabiting the world. The cenote is more than geology. It is the first teacher. For millions of years, it has practiced lessons that humanity has only recently begun to recognize. Stability. Patience. Reciprocity. Constraint. Nothing inside the formation is hurried. Water takes centuries to complete journeys measured in kilometers. Minerals build structures atom by atom. Entire ecosystems emerge from balances so delicate that no engineer would willingly disturb them without first understanding why they exist. The formation never optimized for speed. It optimized for continuity. That distinction is the quiet heart of everything that follows. Modern civilization often mistakes acceleration for progress. The formation offers another measure: persistence. Not the ability to move faster, the ability to endure longer. The civilization described in this book is not an attempt to conquer the formation. It is an attempt to learn from it. Its architecture borrows from it. Its governance reflects it. Its medicine cooperates with it. Its economics protects it. Its culture grows within it. Nothing here is intended to dominate the environment that made it possible. Every institution exists because the formation came first. Long before there were engineers, the limestone was already filtering water. Long before there were physicians, pressure was already shaping biology. Long before there were constitutions, ecological reciprocity had already been governing the living systems that depended upon one another. Humanity is not introducing order into the cenote. It is entering an order that has existed since long before humanity arrived. That realization requires a certain humility. It also requires curiosity. Throughout the chapters ahead, you will encounter engineering that may appear ambitious, governance that may appear unfamiliar, economic models that challenge accepted assumptions, medical proposals that invite careful scrutiny. Treat none of them as isolated inventions. They are translations, attempts to express, in human institutions, principles that the formation has quietly demonstrated for geological time. The cenote becomes a city. Pressure becomes medicine. Stewardship becomes governance. Observation becomes science. Patience becomes economics. Reciprocity becomes law. Depth becomes culture. These transformations are not metaphors. They are the architecture of an emerging civilization. As you proceed, imagine that you are descending. The surface remains above you. The noise grows quieter. Light filters differently. Perspective changes. The descent is gradual because understanding is gradual. No one enters the formation all at once. Each chapter carries you deeper. At first, you notice the geology, then the water, then the infrastructure, then the institutions, then the people. Eventually, you begin noticing something else. The civilization itself has become part of the ecosystem, not imposed upon it, growing within it. That is the aspiration of every enduring civilization, to become so well adapted to the conditions that sustain it that future generations struggle to imagine where nature ended and stewardship began. Perhaps that is the deepest meaning of civilization. Not the triumph of humanity over nature, nor humanity's surrender to nature, but a long negotiation between the two. One in which both emerge stronger because each has learned from the other. You now stand at the edge of that negotiation. The chapters that follow are no longer preliminary. The airlock has sealed. The descent has begun. Welcome to the formation. Revelation of the MXDM method. ChatGPT.com/share/ 6A6-8BF4-9-4BA8-A3E8-A397E649C.
Subscribe.
Thanks for reading MXDM's newsletter. Subscribe for free to receive new posts and support my work with BTC. Send it to 1 NPHXMPFZJVMXSBPQVRWC5 BAKNFU6 or with fiat at PayPal. It's me/Martin Chartrand. Discussion about this episode.
Comments.
Res tax. Recent episodes. The Longevity Principality, promo preview. July 26th, MXDM, aka Pirate 1 VJ Cinemix. Laundry with shampooed hair wash soap under 8 minutes SFX. July 25th. Pipe Dream Part 12. July 24th.
Earth had already built the future.
Pirate First's pipe dream, the Cenote Chronicles, begins.
Part 12. The Post-Scarcity Prototype, the Scarcity Myth. Scarcity is the founding premise of the surface world's economic science. The first sentence of every introductory economics textbook establishes it. Resources are scarce, human wants are unlimited, and economics is the science that studies how societies allocate the scarce resources among the unlimited wants. The distinction between physical scarcity and institutional scarcity is the post-scarcity prototype's founding analytical claim. The economic system's experience scarcity is not determined entirely by the physical resources' abundance or deficit. It is determined by the interaction between the physical resources' abundance or deficit and the institutional system's allocation efficiency. Pipe Dream's energy system dissolves the energy scarcity not by inventing a more efficient solar energy conversion technology or by building a larger renewable energy installation, but by inhabiting the geological formation whose own physical processes, the underground river's hydraulic gradient, the geothermal heat flux, the halocline salinity gradient, and the anoxic zone's biological hydrogen production, continuously produce the energy that the civilization's critical loads require at zero marginal cost. The integration accumulates across the design process's successive decisions. And the infrastructure that the integration logic's complete application produces is the infrastructure whose total manufactured requirement has been minimized by the systematic substitution of the formation's ecological functions for the surface world's manufactured equivalents wherever the integration logic's application identifies the substitution as the design opportunity.
When everything is free, your genome is the only asset left.
Limestone sky, where the water holds the light. We built a city that learned to breathe below the reach of night. Not for conquest, not for gold, not for all the old mistakes, but to make a home where the living could outlast what life takes. And the deep kept time like a patient drum below.
The Longevity Principality, a constitutional draft for the civilization that learned to outlive
Principality, a
itself.
prequel to Constitutional Draft, Age of the Apes. Introduction. Every civilization tells on itself through the institutions it builds. Some build monuments, some build markets, some build prisons and call them order, some build hospitals and call them mercy. The Longevity Principality begins with a simpler and more dangerous idea. If a civilization can learn to preserve life without flattening dignity, then it can learn to preserve continuity without surrendering conscience. Not immortality, not fantasy, not the denial of death. Something more practical and therefore more disruptive. The deliberate production of healthy time. That is the real export, not tourism, not architecture, not even sovereign infrastructure, though all of those matter. Time matters more. Healthy years matter more. The Principality is the place where that realization becomes law. Longevity Principality is not simply a sequel to Pipe Dream. It is the book where civilization discovers that every mechanism for keeping people alive also becomes a mechanism for deciding how they will be governed.
The earth had already built